"There's something you need to know about this camp," said the camp director, his face visible only by the flickering light of the fire. It was summer 1997 in a clearing in the wilderness of southeast Ohio, a place called Camp Sycamore. We had arrived early that morning in an old school bus that smelled like burnt rubber, passing beneath the arched sign that spanned the tall log walls of the campground, built like an old pioneer fortress. For the next 2 months, until early August, our days would be filled with hikes and educational activities, swims and canoe rides in the lake. Our nights filled with marshmallow roast, acoustic guitar, and campfire stories. On our first night, we sat on log stumps around the fire, while a group of counselors stood behind us in the dark like priests. The camp director, Mr. Daniels, dragged his own stump closer to the fire and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "There is a story that we haven't told you," he said. "A story that goes all the way back to the origin of this camp." Mr. Daniels turned and pointed off in the distance. "You've no doubt noticed the great sycamore tree by the lake, yes?" We nodded. The tree was the reason the camp was called Camp Sycamore, and it was impossible to miss. It was the biggest tree in the whole forest. One of the first rules of the camp was that we weren't allowed to climb it, since falling from such a great height was guaranteed death. Also, since the tree was so old, damaging it in any way would mean a great loss for the forest biome. "Yes, you were told to avoid it for those reasons," Mr. Daniels said, after repeating those same warnings. "But there is another reason." "Sir," interrupted one of the junior counselors. She was a young woman named Mia, and even in the moonlight, we could tell that she was beautiful, her long blonde hair glowing like gold as she stepped closer to the fire. "Are you sure they're old enough to hear this?" she asked. Mr. Daniels swung around, stabbing a finger at her in what we would later understand to be just an act, a play to raise the tension, something they had planned together in advance. One of the many secret agreements between the two of them, we would eventually learn. "What would you have me do?" Mr. Daniels said to Mia. "Keep them in the dark. They deserve to know the truth." His face glowed red as he turned back to us again, his voice now barely a whisper. "That tree, you must understand, is special. Arborists will tell you the tree is hundreds and hundreds of years old, older than the state of Ohio even. But those who have lived in the forest know the truth. This sycamore is no older than your grandparents." We didn't understand. We had all read in the camp brochure that the tree likely predated the statehood of Ohio by at least 300 years. Why would they print a lie in their own brochure? It is normally impossible to know the exact age of a living tree, but in this case, we have it on record. Mr. Daniels continued. The tree was planted in 1944 during the height of World War II. Back then, there was no camp here, only one small cabin by the lake, where a young woman lived alone. Her husband was off fighting in Europe, but soon the woman would not be alone, for she was expecting to give birth to a baby. She wrote letters to her husband about how happy she would be when he returned, when they could raise their child together on the shore of the lake. But just when the baby was close to arriving, her husband's letters stopped showing up in the mailbox. She kept writing to him, but she received no response. It was only later that a Western Union telegram had arrived, informing her that her husband had been killed in action. Mr. Daniels took a moment to reach down at his feet, where he had set a canteen of water. Slowly, he unscrewed the cap of the canteen and took a long swig, wiping his mouth as he screwed the cap back on and set the canteen down again at his feet. The young woman, now a widow, was devastated, he said. But she did not have time to dwell on her despair. The same day the telegram had arrived, she went into sudden labor, and all by herself, she gave birth to a baby boy right on the wooden floorboards of the cabin. It should have been a joyous moment for her, but the young widow could barely look at the child without seeing her husband's face staring back at her. She found everything about the baby boy filled her with rage. His cries in the night, his little curled fingers, his bright blue eyes, his hungry mouth on her breast as she nursed him, always hungry for more, more, more. We were elementary school kids, so the mention of breasts should have had us giggling. But the cold tone of Mr. Daniels' voice kept us all silent. One night, Mr. Daniels said, while the baby was sleeping, the young woman lay awake on her cot, listening to these sounds of the forest. She had heard these same sounds each night for years, the rustling of branches, the sighing of leaves in the wind. But tonight, for the first time, it was as if she could decode a language that she had never understood before. She heard the trees communicating. She heard them whispering to her, and to her alone. And the trees told her the same thing over and over again. The trees said there was a way to bring her husband back. We all remember the same feeling when Mr. Daniels got to this point in the story. Like a bag of ice had been poured down the back of our shirts, or like ants were crawling up on our ankles. The trees told the young widow that life could be restored, but she would have to make an offering. Life for life. A tree cannot grow without a seed, after all. And the young widow knew what the trees were telling her. Immediately, she rose from her bed. In her nightgown, she stepped across the open room of the cabin to the cupboard, where she had kept her gardening gloves. She slid them on both hands, and then she put on her work boots by the door, pulling the laces tight. Next, she lifted a small gardening shovel off its hook on the wall and tucked it under her arm. Just before leaving the cabin, she went to the crib and lifted her sleeping baby in her arms. Mr. Daniels tilted his head up at the starry night sky, the vast expanse of the constellations bearing down at us. It was a warm and clear night, he whispered. A night much like tonight. We waited as he gazed upward, awash in the sounds of the burning logs, the crickets in the forest, the wind passing through the trees. The young widow, he said, lowering his eyes. She stepped out into the dark and carried her baby out to the clearing. She laid the baby boy down in a soft padding of grass by the tree line, making sure the baby was wrapped warmly in his blanket. And then she stepped back into the opening, pulled out her shovel, and began digging. She dug and dug. Soon, she had dug a hole big enough to plant a young tree. She set the shovel aside. She needed a rest for a moment, so she sat down on the ground looking out at the lake. The moon floated on the surface of the water, the same moon she and her husband had gazed upon when they were still together, when the entire forest seemed to have been placed here just for them alone. Eventually, she stood up, and she went over to her baby boy. She lifted him up and set him down gently in the hole. She filled the hole with dirt until the sound of the baby boy's shrieks fell silent. None of us moved. We barely breathed. The flames of the fire were dying out, the embers pulsing. The next morning, when the young widow woke up, she tidied up the cabin, put on her prettiest dress and combed her hair, waiting for her husband to appear again through the trees. But when she went outside, she could not find him. The only change in the scenery was a small sycamore tree that had sprouted from the spot where she had planted the seed. By the day's end, the tree had grown up to her waist, By the week's end, the tree had sprouted branches that unfurled high above her head. The young widow realized that she had been tricked. She screamed. She kicked at the sycamore tree, though its trunks held firm against her foot no matter how hard she had attacked it. She yelled up at the other trees of the forest. She said that they had lied to her. But the trees had not lied. They had promised that she would have a life for life, and so she did. But they had not promised what form that life would take. As he had been talking, Mr. Daniels had picked up a stick off the ground and now used it to poke at the fire, collapsing the last remaining logs and suffocating the flames until we were sitting in near total darkness. After years living beside the sycamore tree, he said, the widow could not bear the sight of it any longer. One night, she grabbed a thick rope and climbed up the tree's branches, higher and higher. She tied one end of the rope to a sturdy branch. The other end she fastened into a noose and slipped it over her head, tightening it around her neck. And then she jumped off, her neck snapping as her body swung, her dead eyes gazing out the lake where the moon shone. Hikers passing through the area found her decomposed corpse picked apart by birds a few weeks later. Since the widow had no next of kin, the land was taken over by the state. And a few decades later, when the story of the young widow was all but forgotten, the land became this very camp. But there are still those who remember. There are still those who know to stay away from the sycamore. We all breathed shallow breaths in the dark as Mr. Daniels stood up from his stump, his body looming over us. So, he said, with that I tell you, welcome to Camp Sycamore. Now it's time for bed. Counselors, please take the campers to their cabins. We are older now, all adults, so of course we understand the story Mr. Daniels told us that night could not have been possibly true. It was a story like most other campfire stories, meant to scare and disturb those who heard it. And even now, we would say there is nothing inherently wrong with that. To get a good scare in the woods is a rite of passage for most kids, even if the story Mr. Daniels told us that night was, in retrospect, entirely inappropriate for elementary school kids. But with that being said, when we heard this story as kids, we believed it in our bones. Our faith was only reinforced by the fact that Mr. Daniels seemed to know everything about the forest. On hikes, he could identify every bird by its song, every plant by its leaves and roots, every animal by the faintest of prints in dirt. As we trekked through the woods, listening to him rhapsodize about the wondrous world around us, we felt hypnotized. Stop for a moment, he said one afternoon, crouching down over the dirt. His eyes wandered around us, seeing things that we could not. You see these dips here in the dirt, and these small trees tilting over the path. We nodded, even though we still had trouble seeing what he meant. Well, these are the sure signs of a sinkhole. He stood then, inching forward just a bit, and gave the ground in front of us a good stomp. Amazingly, the earth yielded beneath his foot like a popped bubble, and the ground deflated a few feet down, forming a small hole. We were stunned. A pocket of air, the result of soft sediment, he explained. These sinkholes are not quite large enough to cause serious harm, but they could lead to a sprained ankle. Now let's keep going, and be careful where you step. If Mr. Daniels could predict when the earth would open up, we thought he was as close to a prophet as we would ever meet. Camp Sycamore had been around since the 1950s, but it wasn't until Mr. Daniels took over that the camp truly became itself. After years as a professor of biology at Ohio State, Mr. Daniels took a pay cut to become the camp's director in the early 1980s, having grown tired of the inner office politics of academia and the stuffiness of the classroom. Now, the camp was his classroom, and because of his efforts, Camp Sycamore had earned the kind of acclaim usually reserved for top-tier prep academies. There were wait lists to be accepted as a camper. Our parents had all filled out forms years ago to ensure that we earned spots that summer. Dozens of former campers, including all these senior counselors, had gone on to be accepted to MIT, Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, and other world-renowned universities. The junior counselors who were still in high school excelled in AP and international baccalaureate courses. We liked all the counselors, but by far our favorite was Mia, the blonde-haired girl who had spoken up during the first night's Campfire story. Mia was a junior counselor, about to start her sophomore year in high school. She had never been a camper before, but had earned her spot as a counselor by winning first prize in the 1997 Ohio State Science Day last winter. Mr. Daniels had been a judge in the contest and made a point of offering her the position. Her winning project had been the restoration of the fading colors of a red, orange, and yellow poison dart frog by replicating and coating the frog in a dye found in its natural habitat in the wilds of Costa Rica. We didn't understand anything about it, but when we saw her at the campfire that first night, she seemed like a creature from another world herself. In the daylight, she was just as beautiful, her smile warm and friendly, her blonde hair tied back in a scrunchie as she went about her work in the camp's greenhouse. Mia had taken over as our informal plant biology instructor. We had lessons with her in the morning 3 days a week. She always wore baggy clothes like sweatpants and hoodies, even on hot days, which only added to her allure. Other girls in music videos needed to wear sparkly tight outfits and bikinis. Not Mia. She would have been stunning in a burlap bag. We started the summer with her trying to grow zucchini. She had us all bent over the plant beds in a row as we awkwardly placed these seeds into the soil. "Carefully now," Mia said. "You want to tuck the seed into its bed, and then cover it gently but firmly with the soil." She paced down the line of us in the greenhouse, reviewing our work. Then we all secretly wished she would come up behind and place her hand on ours, guiding them as she layered soil over the seed, patting the soil down. "And then press the soil down with your hands," she said, gently but firmly, to remove any air pockets and keep the seed nice and cozy and snug. "Okay, boys?" We nodded and worked hard not to make mistakes, until all of our seeds were nice and cozy and snug in the tight soil, just like she had taught us. "All that life from a tiny little seed," she said at the end of class. "It's like magic, isn't it?" She seemed so old and wise to us, but of course, we realized now she was just a girl, barely 16 years old. Far too young for the pain she endured that summer. A month after we had arrived at camp, Mia got sick. We were coming back from the lake when we saw her bent over outside the greenhouse, vomiting in the grass. Our lesson with her in the greenhouse was canceled that day, and by the end of the week, Mr. Daniels and Mia moved into the guest wing of his own private residence inside the lodge. He said Mia would be more comfortable with a real bed and shower and privacy, as opposed to sleeping on a bunk bed inside a cabin. "Oh, don't you worry. She'll be all hunky-dory," he said that night in the dining hall as he loaded his paper plate with chicken and potatoes. "But I will say, the fact you boys are so concerned is a testament to how upstanding you all are. Caring for your fellow human being, just as caring for nature, is the true test of character." When he walked off, we all nodded at each other, convinced that we had done our job. No one saw Mia for days. Mr. Daniels said she was in quarantine with a bad bug. She needed a rest, he said, so it was best not to bother her. It wasn't until more than a week later, when we snuck out in the middle of the night, that we saw her again. Sneaking out at night was easy for those in our all-boy cabin. We had realized that our senior counselor was such a heavy sleeper that we could do just about anything. At first, we whispered in the dark and he didn't wake up. Some of us munched on sunflower seeds, or crinkled the wrappers of contraband candy bars, and then we talked in normal voices. Still, he kept on snoring, occasionally rolling over like a bear, his mattress springs squeaking under his weight. After a week, we realized we could sneak out and run around the cabin, amazed and a little afraid at what we could get away with. One night, we had decided to prank the girls in the neighboring cabin. We wanted to put shampoo in their shoes so when they stepped into them the next morning, their toes would squish into the soapy goop. But as we snuck up the hill in the moonlight and past the lodge, we heard a door creak open, and we all scrambled into these shadows to hide. Out into the night air stepped Mia, her body steaming in the fog. We barely recognized her at first. She wasn't wearing her normal baggy pants and hoodie. She was almost naked, stepping barefoot over the dirt in nothing but underwear and a tight tank top. When she turned, we saw her swollen belly. She began walking down the hill toward the lake. We felt pulled toward her. We followed behind, trying not to be seen. It was easy because she seemed not to see anything around her. She walked free and alone. She floated, her arms swinging as she reached the sycamore tree by the shore of the lake. There, beneath its branches, she slid off her tank top. She stepped out of her underwear, and now she was fully nude, glowing in the dark. She undid the scrunchie from her hair, letting it fall loose and free, and we watched as she waded into the water. She moved like a lake creature, floating on her back in the moonlight, her rounded belly slick and glistening. We watched her splash around, sometimes disappearing under the water for so long that we wanted to shout out at her, but always she would resurface, slicking her golden hair back. After what felt like hours, she finally swam back to the shore and walked out. The most amazing sight any of us had ever seen. As we watched her wringing out the water from her hair, we knew we were committing some terrible sin, some intrusion of her privacy that could not be forgiven, but none of us could look away. In the following decades, most of the boys who were at that camp that summer would go on to spend years in therapy or counseling of some kind. A good number of us developed drug and alcohol dependencies. Others turned to the church, hoping they could be cleansed of their guilt through sheer devotion. Some of us just disappeared. There is a private Facebook group someone started. Most of us joined it, all for different reasons. The page will sit unused for months, years, until someone makes a new post, usually late at night, and the post is almost always the same. How could we not have known? How could we have done what we did? If there are any responses at all, usually they will repeat the same old excuse. We were just kids. But none of us believe that answers anything. After we saw Mia swimming in the lake that night, none of us talked about it during the day when others were around. We went on hikes with Mr. Daniels, watching out for sudden sinkholes on the path. We worked with the other counselors in the greenhouse. We swam in the lake and tried having fun, as if the warm, metallic waters hadn't been transformed into a sacred space. But at night, when our counselor snored on his mattress, a few of us decided that it was important to go check on her. We all knew the real reason was because we all wanted to see her again. Every night, Mia swam through our dreams, and we would have given anything to see her in real life. Days went by and there was no sign of Mia. Boys came back and reported what they had seen, which was nothing. The same sleeping cabins, the same wind in the trees, the same shadow of the giant sycamore tree over the empty lake. We did spot Mr. Daniels though. One night, he stepped out of the lodge and just stood there in the dark, taking deep breaths as he looked out at the lake at the bottom of the hill. Fireflies blinked around him, and he swatted at them and said, "Screw off, get away. Screw off, Jesus Christ." We crouched back in the darkness until we heard the slam of the door as Mr. Daniels went back inside. It was less than a week later, the middle of the night, when some of the boys in our cabin shook us awake. Baby, emerging from our dreams. It took us a few seconds before we understood what they were saying. "Baby, we saw a baby," they whispered. "Mr. Daniels with a baby." The air outside that night was the same temperature as our bodies, and it felt like we were moving through the water as we ran out of the cabin. Some of the boys had followed Mr. Daniels as he had left the lodge. The ones who had ran to the cabin to wake us up, then led us down the hill toward the lake, where a few others were supposed to be waiting to show us the way. The sycamore tree gleamed in the fog over the shore. We ran toward it. We were so sure it would play a role in whatever came next. And that's something almost all of us still struggle with to this day. All these years later, we wanted there to be meaning in what had happened, for it to signify something, anything. We couldn't admit to ourselves that the tree and everything else, it had meant nothing, that it was just a campfire story. So we ran toward the sycamore, certain in a way only kids can be, until we heard someone call to us from behind in a whispered shout. "Hey guys!" We stopped, turned. The guys who had followed Mr. Daniels were waiting at the edge of the woods back up at the hill, standing by the entrance to a path that led away from the lake. "It's this way, come on," they said. What happened next might as well have been a dream. The path winding through the woods, the pockets of moonlight through the tree branches, the small sinkholes that appeared every now and then, which we hopped over so effortlessly. We found the others waiting belly down at the edge of a small cliff, overlooking a clearing down below. They looked like cowboys ready to engage in a firefight over a canyon. Crawling up to them, we heard Mr. Daniels before we saw him. He was down in the clearing. We heard him scraping and digging at the ground with a stick. As we peeked over the edge, we saw him shoving the dirt aside with his hands. We didn't see the baby at first. The others had to point it out for us. It was so small, a tiny bundle on the ground by a tree a few yards behind Mr. Daniels. The baby was wrapped in a blanket. We all remember the color. Baby blue, moonlit. Not more than a minute after us new arrivals got there, Mr. Daniels stood and looked down at the hole he had dug. We had wondered what he was doing, why he was standing so still. After what felt like forever, his shoulders seemed to droop, and then he turned and walked over to the baby. "Shh," we heard him say, his voice floating up to us as he crouched down, lifting the baby in his arms. Mia showed up 3 days later in the dining hall at breakfast. Everyone was coming up to her and telling her how glad they were that she was better. She looked a little frazzled and exhausted, her eyes more baggy than before. But she managed to smile and thank everyone for the kind words. When we stood in line behind her for the breakfast buffet, she turned around and smiled at us. "It sure is good to see you boys again." She grabbed her plate from the bin, her fork and knife, her spoon. Even now, no, even more than ever, she was beautiful to us. We watched her scoop eggs from the metal buffet tray onto her plate, as if we were witnessing the sun parting through the clouds after a rainstorm. "I hope you haven't forgotten everything I've taught you now, have you?" She smiled again. She picked up a pepper shaker and shook out a little over her eggs. "It'll be nice to be back in the greenhouse again, huh?" There was so much we wanted to tell her, and we were about to respond when Mr. Daniels appeared from behind us. "Well, look who's back in fine spirits," he said, beaming. "We all missed you, Mia, didn't we, boys?" Mia closed her mouth, her eyes squinting a little. But just as quickly, the expression vanished from her face and she smiled again. She nodded down at us but didn't say anything as she drifted off toward a table in the corner. All that breakfast, we glanced back over our shoulders, watching her deposit eggs into her mouth and then chew slowly, her eyes looking off at nothing. Over the next few days, Mr. Daniels followed Mia around everywhere. In the greenhouse, Mia went through her normal lessons about planting seeds, while Mr. Daniels stood in the corner. "Pat it down gently but firmly," she said, pressing her palm down over a pot of soil. "Remember, we want the seed nice and cozy and snug, okay?" Before the lesson was over, Mia said she needed to take a break, and Mr. Daniels suggested she go and lie down. She nodded as she slid off her gardening gloves, and we watched as he escorted her out of the greenhouse. The rest of the night, whenever Mia was out and around the camp, she mostly just walked from place to place, nodding and smiling at people, Mr. Daniels close behind. There was something different about her though. When she looked at us, she seemed to be looking right through us. Near the end, just before everything fell apart, some of us spotted Mia and Mr. Daniels talking outside of the greenhouse. They were whispering but yelling, the kind of yelling where both were trying to keep their voices down. "I told you," Mr. Daniels said. "You haven't told me anything." Mia, yes, I have. And I'll say it again and again and again. Everything's fine. She's fine, I'm fine. You're fine." "Where then?" Mia was close to Mr. Daniels, shout whispering in his face. "Just tell me where." "In a safe place. In a program. She's..." "Oh, bullshit. Don't give me that. A program. What does that even mean?" "You don't think I have those kind of connections? For Christ's sake, Mia, I run a summer camp. My whole job is dealing with kids." "What?" "You certainly do deal with kids. I'll give you that." "Hey, no, you listen to me. I want proof. I want to know she's fine. You said so. Okay, wait, okay. So your job is dealing with this stuff. Great. That means you have the proper paperwork. So, give me that, Paul. Give me some freaking proof. Otherwise, I'm leaving." "Paul, We had never heard any of the counselors or camp staff refer to Mr. Daniels by his first name. That night, Mia wasn't at dinner in the dining hall. By the next day, we had heard that she had been sent home. She still needed to recover, Mr. Daniels said, and she would be much more comfortable at home. But we would see her soon enough, not to worry. She'll be back before you know it, he said, grinning. A week later, 4 police cars showed up and took Mr. Daniels away in handcuffs. To this day, none of us can remember who told the police about the baby. All we know is that the police officers had gathered all of the campers and counselors together in the spot by the fire pit. And then a bearded man with glasses, who looked like a guidance counselor, stepped up and announced that camp was ending early. One of us, we still can't remember who, said as we were shuffling into the buses, "This is because of the baby, isn't it?" The bearded man and the 2 police officers beside the bus all stopped, as if someone had just fired a gun into the air. "Could you," said the bearded man. "I'm sorry, but could you please repeat that?" Our parents couldn't hide the news from us, although they tried their best. They made sure to keep the nightly news turned off for the next few weeks. But the story of a beloved middle-aged camp director doing what he did to his counselor and then doing what he did to the baby on campgrounds was sensational enough to make national headlines for more than a month. We only got to see Mia one last time after she had left camp. It was at the courthouse during the trial. Some of us had been called to testify, despite our parents' misgivings. We were what the prosecution called vital witnesses. All during the trial, Mia sat in a black dress in the courtroom. On the trial's second day, we were outside in the courthouse parking lot. A few of us were standing around in our little suits, while our parents murmured to one another. That's when the passenger side door of a passing car was flung open, and out of the moving car jumped Mia, still wearing her black courtroom dress. She fell on her knees over the pavement as the car screeched to a halt, and then she got up, scrambling to her feet. None of our parents saw her run towards us. They only noticed when she had started screaming, "Look at me, boys, look. How could you? How could you?" They turned just as Mia pushed past them and bent over us, screaming in our faces, "You could have done something. You could have stopped him." One of our parents tried ushering her back, but she kept shouting, her face swollen as she choked through sobs. "You saw it. You saw what he did. You could have saved her." It all happened so fast. Eventually, someone pulled Mia away. She was put back in the car and driven off, and we never saw her again. On the ride home from the courthouse, all of our parents did a version of the same thing. "Hey pal, none of this is your fault." "Okay, champ. Hey, maybe we should stop for some McDonald's on the way home. Or some ice cream, how does that sound?" They were wrong. Only Mia knew. Only she saw us for who we were. In the decades that followed, many of us have had children of our own. We have felt our babies curl their hands around our fingers, their soft bodies cradled in our laps. But we can still hear Mia screaming at us. We wake up at night hearing it. It was as if she had known the truth all along, as if she had known we had been lying. We hadn't told the police everything. Even in court, we didn't tell them about what had happened after Mr. Daniels had buried the baby that night in the woods. We didn't tell them when Mr. Daniels ran out of the woods back to the lodge. All of us boys scrambled down the slope and stood over the spot where he had dug the hole. We didn't tell them that a pocket of air must have been right below us in the dirt, another result of soft sediment on the campground pass. because the moment all of our weight circled around the hole, the ground shifted. At first, we thought it was the sprouting of a magical tree. We had felt it under our feet. Dirt sunk deeper all at once, as if a trapdoor had opened 10 feet below us. But as the dirt fell deeper, instead of a tree sprouting out, only a small pale hand appeared out of the ground, clenching and unclenching, grasping at the cool night air. Some of us still try to believe that clenching hand was just the result of the dirt moving, like a tree limb bobbing in the wind. But none of us disagree about what happened next. Together, we got down on our hands and knees and pushed more dirt into the hole, covering the little hand again until the ground was level. And then we pressed our palms over the dirt. We pressed gently but firmly to remove any air pockets, so the seed would be nice and cozy and snug, just how Mia had taught us.